Good evening, esteemed listeners, and welcome to this quiet corner where ancient tales find new breath. Allow your mind's eye to travel with me now. Imagine a place vast and imposing, shrouded not merely in mist, but in the heavy, tangible silence of decades. St. Jude's abandoned hospital. The rain lashed against the crumbling brickwork on that particular night, each gust sounding like a collective sigh from the empty wards. The darkness was so complete it seemed to press against the very panes of the broken windows, seeking entry to smother the last vestiges of light. I stood before its enormous, decaying facade, the single beam of my torch cutting a weak path through the downpour, feeling the profound weight of the hospital's history. It was a place where countless lives had begun, ended, or taken a sudden, unforeseen turn. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from a deeper, more profound emotion. A strange sense of returning to an unfinished chapter of my own past. I was there on a quest to reconcile a long-ago failure, a promise made years ago under far different skies and never kept. I felt a palpable sense that the truth I sought was trapped within these echoing halls, a fragile secret waiting for the right moment, the right storm to be revealed. If you enjoyed the story, please like and share. I encourage you now to enter your location and local time, letting the rhythm of this narrative meet you exactly where you are. Now, try to unleash your imagination. The heavy, ornate doors groaned in protest as I forced them open, the sound echoing through the cavernous entrance hall like the moan of a distressed patient. The air inside was thick, cold, and utterly still, carrying the faint, sterile scent of disinfectant long forgotten, mixed with the earthy musk of decay. Dust motes danced in the brief light of my torch beam as I moved slowly across the checkerboard marble floor, the silence so absolute it magnified the smallest sound, the drip of water from a cracked ceiling pipe, the distant rumble of thunder. I remembered visiting this place as a youth, accompanying my uncle who had been an orderly here before its closure. He had often spoken of the kindness of the nurses and the dedication of the doctors, but always with a curious sadness in his eyes, as if recalling a beauty that had been tragically marred. I could still hear his voice, a low, melodic rumble, cautioning me about the third-floor south wing, not with tales of the supernatural, but with a warning about a silence there that was too deep, too complete, child, as if life itself had been edited out. This memory, a strange and unexpected detail, caused me to hesitate at the main staircase. Why had he emphasized that specific area? Was there a mundane, logical reason for the unsettling quiet of that wing, or did it hold the key to the unspoken tragedy my uncle had always alluded to? I took a deep, steadying breath, the stale air filling my lungs. The very act of stepping onto the first tread of the grand staircase felt like stepping across a threshold of time. But was the faint, metallic clang I thought I heard from the upper floor merely the wind shifting a loose piece of equipment, or a genuine signal from the hospital's sleeping history? The quest had begun, and the weight of the past was already settling heavily upon my shoulders. I ascended the broad, sweeping staircase, my torchlight catching the mahogany of the banister, now dull with neglect. Each step was taken with deliberate care, mindful of the creaks that echoed far too loudly in the suffocating silence. The second floor was a maze of patient rooms and examination bays, all stripped bare save for the occasional piece of medical debris, a rusted bed frame here, a shattered thermometer there.
It was a space saturated with the energy of past suffering and fleeting relief, yet it yielded no immediate secrets, only a profound, melancholy emptiness. I continued my deliberate exploration, moving toward the less trafficked corridor that led toward the administrative offices, a space more likely to hold written documentation of the hospital's history. As I navigated the hallway, a strange sound interrupted the narrative silence. A faint, persistent, rhythmic tapping, subtle, yet unmistakably regular, emanating from behind a locked door near the wing's end. This was the first sound that was not a consequence of the storm or my own movement. It was an unexpected detail that suggested a presence, or perhaps a fragile mechanism still stubbornly at work. I paused, holding my breath, straining to discern the source, but the tapping ceased as abruptly as it began, leaving me with only the question: had it been the rhythmic drop of condensation onto a tin surface, or something far more deliberate? Pushing the question aside temporarily, I focused on the door to the old head nurse's office. The lock, a heavy brass fixture, surrendered to a carefully applied tool, and I slipped inside. The room was relatively intact, protected from the elements. A large wooden desk dominated the space, and it was here, tucked beneath a stack of brittle attendance sheets, that I made a crucial discovery: a small, leather-bound book, its cover embossed simply with the initial A. It was a personal diary, its pages filled with elegant, sloping handwriting. A powerful, memorable, emotional moment settled over me as I lifted the artifact. This was not a procedural record. This was the intimate voice of someone who had lived and worked within these very walls. I gently opened the diary to the first entry, shielding the delicate pages from the damp air. The script introduced the author as Amelia, a nurse who had worked at St. Jude's during its final tumultuous years. Her opening sentences spoke not of medicine, but of the immense, almost overwhelming pressure of keeping the hospital functioning amidst severe staff shortages and financial instability. She wrote with a mixture of immense professional pride and profound personal exhaustion, describing the wards as places of both miraculous healing and crushing hopelessness. The strange and unexpected detail was her obsessive focus on the hospital's chapel, often mentioning long hours spent there late at night, not in prayer, but merely seeking the true quiet. She described the chapel's silence not as an empty absence, but as a vibrant stillness that allowed her to think clearly. This was peculiar for a pragmatic nurse. Why did she find clarity in a forgotten chapel rather than the order of her own office? The diary became a fragile map, promising to guide me through the emotional landscape of St. Jude's. The mystery of the rhythmic tapping receded, replaced by the immediate, compelling questions presented by Amelia's own secretive life. I knew then that the key to the hospital's physical and historical truth was interwoven with the threads of her personal journey. But was the tapping related to a structural flaw in the building, or a clue left by someone years ago? I had to continue reading. I retreated to the relative shelter of the office, shielding the fragile diary pages from the encroaching dampness of the deserted hospital. The soft beam of my torch illuminated Amelia's elegant script as I began to delve into the depths of her personal narrative. The entries were a tapestry woven with dedication and profound sorrow, detailing the immense strain of her duties and the emotional toll exacted by the constant proximity to sickness and loss. She wrote with palpable affection for her patients, describing their fleeting triumphs and their quiet, tragic defeats. The core of her current entries, however, began to focus on a growing sense of professional isolation and ethical distress. She alluded vaguely to a situation involving a delicate case that was being handled with unusual secrecy by one of the senior physicians, a situation that she felt compelled to document but was forbidden to discuss. This ethical struggle formed a powerful, memorable, emotional moment, revealing her deep internal conflict between loyalty to the institution and loyalty to her own conscience. Then, the tone of the diary shifted dramatically, descending into a spiral of despair that was both unexpected and disturbing. Amelia detailed the sudden loss of a close friend, another nurse at St. Jude's, whom she described only as M. The death, which she noted in the diary was officially ruled an accident, seemed to Amelia to carry a weight of hidden anguish. She wrote, "M's silence now screams louder than any living voice." She carried a secret burden, one that St. Jude's was supposed to lift, not crush. This cryptic statement, a strange and unexpected detail, suggested a profound betrayal within the hospital's walls, moving the narrative from professional exhaustion to a deep personal tragedy. The later entries became shorter, more fragmented, and increasingly fraught with fear. She began to write about the feeling of being watched, not by patients or colleagues, but by an unseen, pervasive presence that made the air in the empty corridors feel heavy. Her final dated entry was brief and heartrending. "The decision is made. I cannot bear the silence of this great empty machine any longer. I must safeguard the truth of the child before I am also silenced." The phrase, "truth of the child," was underlined multiple times, a clear, desperate clue. Following this, the handwriting became a frantic, illegible scrawl, and the last few pages were violently torn out, leaving only ragged remnants. I looked up from the diary, my mind reeling. The narrative had taken a sharp turn. From a story of a devoted nurse, it had transformed into a clear documentation of a profound tragedy, the tragedy of Nurse Amelia. Her despair was real. Her fear was meticulously recorded. But was her death, which I now strongly suspect was not natural, an isolated event? Or was it directly connected to the delicate case and the truth of the child she desperately sought to protect? The hospital's immense, impersonal silence now felt less like an absence and more like a carefully constructed vault designed to contain these agonizing secrets. This question: was the tragedy an isolated event or a part of a larger cover-up? Was the immediate mystery. I had a life, a conscience, and an untold story in my hands. I needed to find the missing pages and discover the nature of this truth.
The desperate final lines of Nurse Amelia's diary provided the direction I needed. Her last cryptic notation, emphasizing the need to safeguard the truth of the child, clearly pointed toward a physical clue, something she had hidden before her end. Knowing that she found solace in the hospital's chapel, I reasoned that if she had to quickly conceal a document or object, a location outside the immediate scrutiny of the patient wards and administrative offices would have been her choice. The chapel, located on the ground floor and rarely used in the hospital's final days, was the most likely candidate for her secret repository. I retraced my steps down the grand staircase, the profound silence of the lower floor feeling even heavier now that I was armed with Amelia's heartbreaking confession. The chapel was situated in a secluded wing, accessible through a long, narrow service corridor. When I finally reached it, the door, unlike the others, was ajar, hanging slightly off its lower hinge. The room was small and austere, containing only a few rows of wooden pews and a simple altar. The atmosphere within was, indeed, different, possessing the vibrant stillness Amelia had described, a quiet that seemed to absorb sound rather than merely reflect it.
I began my meticulous search, moving slowly, running my hands along the dusty woodwork, feeling for any irregularity, any loose panel. It was behind the altar where the wall met the floor that I discovered the strange and unexpected detail. A small, carefully concealed brass latch, almost invisible beneath a layer of grime. The latch yielded with a soft click, revealing a shallow, brick-lined compartment. Within, wrapped in a piece of faded blue linen, was not a document, but a single, pristine white baby booty and a folded, yellowed sheet of paper. As I carefully unwrapped the paper, a faint, undeniable scent of lavender rose from the linen, a delicate, unexpected fragrance that had somehow survived the decades of decay. This sweet scent was a potent, memorable, emotional moment, immediately connecting me to the tangible, personal reality of the life Amelia was trying to protect. The document was not a missing diary page, but a detailed, handwritten post-procedure summary from a doctor not listed on the hospital's public roster. The note, dated shortly before Amelia's final entry, referred to a successful clandestine in utero procedure performed on a patient identified only by a coded number, patient 417. The key sentence in the summary read, "The child is viable and healthy, now requiring placement under strict, private custody." The note made it clear that the child was to be registered unofficially, a deliberate move to bypass standard adoption and birth records. The question now was sharp and immediate. Was this procedure and the subsequent secret placement the truth of the child Amelia was dying protecting? The document strongly suggested a conspiracy among certain staff members to facilitate a secret birth and placement, likely involving substantial financial transactions. But was the lavender scent merely a coincidence? Or was it a signature left by Amelia, a specific, loving memory attached to the child she fought to save? I needed to find out who patient 417 was and who this secretive doctor was to solve the profound mystery unfolding in the silence of St. Jude's Hospital.
The post-procedure summary, with its coded reference to patient 417 and the unsigned doctor's note, immediately intensified the mystery. I held the fragile paper, the lavender scent still faint but persistent, a tangible link to a life saved and a secret fiercely guarded. The details confirmed a major breach of medical protocol, suggesting a private arrangement that went beyond the bounds of ethical practice, a dangerous situation that undoubtedly led to Amelia's profound distress and likely her demise. I needed to identify the doctor and, more critically, the patient. My gaze fell upon a filing cabinet tucked away in a dusty corner of the chapel sacristy. It was a heavy, industrial cabinet, the kind used for long-term storage of sensitive documents. After a few minutes of careful maneuvering, the lock gave way and I began sifting through the disorganized, decades-old files. Most were mundane records of chapel maintenance and hospital inventory, a dead end. But in the bottom drawer, wedged behind a stack of hymnals, was a small, personalized ledger, clearly not official hospital property. Its title page bore the initials DRE, and it appeared to be a doctor's private log of unsanctioned or highly sensitive cases. This was the strange and unexpected detail I had been searching for. The entries were sparse, written in a tight, professional hand, detailing procedures that seemed to bypass the hospital's main record system. I meticulously scanned the ledger until I found an entry matching the date and nature of the procedure in Amelia's note. The entry corresponding to patient 417 was brief but devastatingly informative. It listed the patient's actual name, Eliza Thorne, and confirmed the identity of the signatory on the post-procedure note, Dr. Elias Redgrave, DRE, a physician who had quietly left St. Jude's immediately before the hospital's final closure. The note beside Eliza Thorne's name simply read, "Successful delivery, adoption facilitated via private channel, mother unwilling to acknowledge legal paternity, full confidentiality secured with nurse A." The phrase "full confidentiality secured with nurse A," which clearly referred to Amelia, cemented her direct, ethical involvement in this secret arrangement. A wave of profound sadness washed over me, a memorable emotional moment. This was not merely a case of illicit adoption, it was a desperate private act carried out by a young mother, concealed by a compassionate nurse, and facilitated by a doctor operating outside the law. The ledger's entry raised a critical, mysterious question. Was the adoption truly private and consensual? Or was Nurse Amelia's subsequent fear and tragic end a consequence of discovering that the arrangement was coerced or financially exploitative? Amelia had referred to the truth of the child as something that needed to be safeguarded, which suggests the private arrangement had become dangerously corrupted. The atmosphere in the chapel, which had felt momentarily peaceful, now felt heavy with the weight of this moral compromise. I realized that the secret was not just about a hidden birth, but about a subsequent betrayal that led to a nurse's despair. I needed to find any subsequent record of Eliza Thorne or the child to understand how the situation became so perilous.
Armed with the names Eliza Thorne, Dr. Elias Redgrave, and Nurse Amelia, I returned my focus to the hospital's upper floors, specifically the third floor south wing, the area my uncle had always spoken of with peculiar sadness. If the procedure was meant to be secret, the recovery and initial placement of the child would have occurred in a secluded, rarely visited location. The hospital structure suggested that the south wing housed the private and semi-private recovery suites, making it the most logical place to conceal a sensitive situation like that of patient 417. The journey to the third floor was unnerving. The air here was noticeably colder. The silence not just deep, but oppressive, just as my uncle had described. The corridor was lined with smaller, more exclusive rooms, and as I walked, my attention was suddenly arrested by a fleeting, barely audible sound, a soft, almost ethereal whispered name. It sounded like a single syllable, drawn out and frail, a breath of sound escaping the heavy silence. I'd paused instantly, my heart pounding, convinced I had misheard, yet the sound left a strange tingling sensation on the periphery of my hearing. It was the most unsettling moment since I entered the hospital. A strange and unexpected detail. Was it the wind creating a complex acoustic illusion in the fractured masonry? Or was this the residual echo of a desperate plea from the past? The sound, though immediately dismissed by my rational mind as an environmental anomaly, fueled my determination. I systematically checked each room. Most were empty, their windows cracked and dusty. It was in the final room, at the end of the hall, a corner suite that offered a small private adjoining space, that I found something significant. This small, secluded room had clearly been used as a temporary nursery. Tucked into the bottom of a built-in wooden cabinet, carefully protected by a few sheets of old newspaper, was a single fading photograph. It was a simple black-and-white image, its edges curled with age, depicting a young woman, a girl really, with kind, weary eyes, holding a bundled infant to her chest. A memorable emotional moment settled over me as I gently lifted the photograph.
The young woman's expression was a heartbreaking blend of love and profound, devastating loss. Scrawled faintly on the back of the photo, in a hurried hand, were 3 initials, E.T. This was a powerful clue. The features of the young woman in the photograph aligned perfectly with what I had imagined for Eliza Thorne, patient 417. The woman in the photo was holding the truth of the child that Amelia had tried to protect. But was the whispered name I thought I heard moments ago connected to this image, perhaps the child's name? Or was it merely the culmination of the immense pressure of the investigation? I turned the photo over again. I needed a clear, undeniable link between this young mother, the nurse, and the doctor's illegal arrangement to fully unravel the tragic web spun within St. Jude's. The image, as fragile as it was, became the new center of the mystery. The fading photograph of Eliza Thorne and her infant, now tucked safely into my breast pocket, served as a poignant anchor to the unfolding human drama. It was a tangible piece of the past, connecting the cold facts of the ledger to the profound living reality of a young mother's sacrifice. My mission to reconcile a long-ago failure at St. Jude's now felt intensely personal, woven inextricably with the tragic fate of Nurse Amelia and the secretive life of Eliza Thorne. This shared ground between my past and the hospital's secrets was what had drawn me back to this decaying structure. I settled onto a dusty windowsill, momentarily allowing the past to flood my senses. I reflected on the promise I had broken, a promise made not to Eliza or Amelia, but to a very dear friend who had been a young orderly at St. Jude's during its final years, the same orderly who was my uncle. He had always expressed deep suspicion about the circumstances surrounding the closure of the hospital, speaking of an essential record that had vanished and a strange, abrupt silence that had fallen over the staff just before the doors were officially locked. He had promised him, before his passing, that I would return to St. Jude's one day and uncover the truth that had caused him such persistent, quiet grief. This was the memorable emotional moment, the flashback to the promise of a reunion, not with a person, but with a truth he never managed to grasp. My uncle had repeatedly alluded to a secret involving a kind nurse and a desperate mother who were unfairly treated. He had even mentioned finding a small, lavender-scented item, perhaps the very baby booty I now possessed, and being intimidated into returning it to an anonymous superior. He had never used the names Amelia or Eliza, but the details, the kind nurse, the secrecy, the lavender, were too specific to be coincidental. The question that lingered in his mind, and now in mine, was simple yet profound. Had the wealthy, influential family who had supposedly adopted the child used their power to silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth of the unofficial arrangement? This possibility transformed the narrative from a simple case of secretive adoption into a story of power, corruption, and the silencing of good people. The strange and unexpected detail from my memory involved a cryptic note my uncle once showed me, a single typed sentence on a piece of hospital stationery. "The record is held where the living meet the gone." At the time, I dismissed it as nonsensical rambling. Now, standing in the oppressive silence of St. Jude's, I understood its meaning. The central truth was to be found in the place where birth records, the living, overlapped with medical records of the deceased, the gone. This pointed clearly to the hospital's centralized records department, a massive, rarely accessed vault in the basement. The fear Amelia had felt and the sadness my uncle carried were real, consequences of crossing powerful forces. I needed to access that basement vault to find the crucial final link. But Was the basement vault still intact after all these years of decay? Or had the essential record been purposely destroyed long ago?
Guided by my uncle's cryptic note, "The record is held where the living meet the gone," I navigated the labyrinthine back corridors toward the hospital's basement. This area, accessible only by a single, rusty service elevator that was long out of order, and a damp, treacherous set of concrete steps, represented the physical end of the hospital's operational life. The air in the stairwell was thick with the smell of mold and stagnant water, a profound contrast to the lingering lavender scent from the chapel, yet both were powerful, olfactory markers of the hospital's emotional history. Finally, I reached the vast, cold cavern of the basement. The storage area was immense, its concrete floor crisscrossed by pipes and cables. My torchlight cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of steel shelving laden with discarded equipment, and crucially, the large, fortress-like steel vault of the records department. The heavy door was sealed, but not locked with any complex mechanism. It had simply been bolted shut with a massive external padlock, a strangely simple security measure for such sensitive information. This was a significant, strange, and unexpected detail. It suggested that the conspirators were less concerned with internal access and more with preventing any official inspection. I managed to bypass the padlock using carefully selected tools, and the heavy door groaned open, revealing a room that was surprisingly well preserved, shielded from the water damage affecting the rest of the basement. Inside, filing cabinets were packed tightly, containing decades of the hospital's operational history. I moved immediately to the section labeled Vital Statistics and Postnatal Records, the area that represented the living part of my uncle's clue. After a meticulous, tense search, I located a cabinet designated for delayed or corrected registrations. Within it, I found a folder marked simply Thorn Redgrave Inquiry. This was the undeniable physical proof I needed. Inside were the official adoption records. The documents were complex and disturbing. They confirmed that Eliza Thorne, under severe emotional and financial duress, had relinquished her child. The records showed that Dr. Elias Redgrave had grossly overstepped his professional boundaries, acting as the intermediary to place the infant with a powerful, wealthy family who were desperate for a child and willing to pay a substantial sum to bypass legal waiting periods. The powerful, memorable, emotional moment occurred when I found a signed, internal memo from Amelia dated shortly before her final diary entry. In it, she formally raised her concern that the adoption fee had been presented to the financially vulnerable Eliza as a payment for the child, not merely compensation for medical costs, constituting a morally and legally reprehensible transaction. This document was a smoking gun, revealing the depth of the corruption and the reason for Amelia's profound distress. This detailed evidence provided the key to the final mystery. The system was not merely breached, it was corrupted by greed and exploitation. I now held the full narrative of the child's true lineage and the moral failure of St. Jude's. But was the powerful family who received the child ever held accountable? Or did they successfully suppress all evidence of their involvement? I needed the final pages to confirm the fate of Eliza and the child.
The folder Thorn/Redgrave Inquiry held the harrowing truth, not only confirming Amelia's worst fears, but also illuminating the true depth of the corruption. The records revealed that the wealthy family who took the child had acted aggressively to seal all related documentation and silence any dissenting voices, exactly as my uncle had suspected. The financial exchange was substantial, and the documents detailed the use of highly influential legal counsel to ensure that Eliza Thorne, under the pretense of private medical care, was effectively isolated and pressured into signing away her parental rights. The revelation of the hidden family was contained in a final, fragile document within the folder, an adoption certificate, unofficial but highly detailed,
naming the adopting parents as Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Vance, a family whose name resonated with power and prominence, tying the tragedy directly to the highest levels of local society. This was the critical missing piece. However, the most touching and unexpected detail was the discovery of a small hand-drawn sketch tucked inside the certificate. It was a simple, childlike drawing of a woman with a kind smile, labeled simply Auntie A. A note accompanying the drawing, written in a different hand than Eliza's, read, "We never forgot her. She gave us the first gift." This small drawing served as a powerful, memorable emotional moment. It confirmed that despite the forced secrecy and the tragic circumstances of her passing, Amelia's sacrifice had not been forgotten by the child she had protected during their earliest days. It suggested that the child, now an adult and potentially aware of their history through the small, subtle clues left behind, had somehow been made aware of the compassionate nurse who had shielded them during their earliest days. The familial bond that was secretly forged, the profound connection between the desperate mother, the protective nurse, and the innocent child, was now laid bare. Amelia's risk was taken out of pure, unselfish love, not for professional advancement, and the child's small tribute was her legacy. The final piece of written evidence provided closure on Eliza Thorne's fate. She was relocated from St. Jude's shortly after Amelia's death, provided with a modest financial settlement, and cautioned never to attempt contact with the child or discuss the procedure. Her final signed statement indicated her immense grief, but acknowledged the child was now safe and loved, a sentiment that offered a sliver of tragic hope. The question that remained was immediate and focused. Did the child, now an adult and potentially aware of their history through the small subtle clues left behind, ever attempt to seek out the truth of their lineage? The story demanded a final act of reconciliation. I had the truth of the child's identity and the injustice done, but I needed to know the outcome of this knowledge for the individuals involved. But was the current location of the Harrison Vance family available in any of these records, providing a direct path to the surviving family member? I meticulously reviewed the file for any modern contact information, knowing the next step required leaving the shadows of St. Jude's and entering the light of the present day.
The final document in the folder, an internal hospital communication regarding the termination of Dr. Redgrave, contained the unexpected detail I had hoped for. A modern address and phone number for the law firm that had handled the Harrison Vance adoption, a crucial, final link to the present day. I carefully secured all the documents, the diary, the ledger, the note, the photograph, and the records, knowing that the truth of St. Jude's was now fully in my possession. My final mission, the one I had promised my uncle, was not merely to find the truth, but to ensure that the legacy of Nurse Amelia and the memory of Eliza Thorne were reconciled with the life of the child they protected. I left the cold silence of the basement vault and ascended back into the fading light of the main hall, the hospital's oppressive atmosphere seemingly lifting with the weight of the recovered secrets. The following morning, operating not as a detective, but as a custodian of history, I presented the full, documented narrative to the law firm, detailing the unethical and coerced nature of the adoption, emphasizing Amelia's noble, tragic intervention. The evidence was irrefutable, especially the signed memo from Amelia detailing the financial exploitation. The story was not meant for public exposure, but for the one person who deserved to know the full context of their birth. Through the law firm, I was put in touch with the child, now a successful and compassionate adult. A strange and unexpected detail that spoke to the resilience of the human spirit. The adult, who had always sensed a guarded secret about their origins, recognized the faint familiar scent of lavender from the baby booty I sent, and confirmed the Auntie A drawing from their childhood belongings. The revelation brought a profound, memorable emotional moment of simultaneous grief and gratitude. The adult finally understood the nature of the secrecy and the tragic sacrifice made by the nurse. The final act of reconciliation was the legacy restored and the hospital's peace. The adult,
deeply moved by the story of Amelia and Eliza, chose to honor their memory. They anonymously purchased the abandoned St. Jude's Hospital property, not to renovate it, but to establish a foundation dedicated to ethical practices in maternity and adoption services, named in memory of Nurse Amelia. By doing so, they acknowledged their true lineage and transformed the building's decaying husk into a permanent monument of compassion, effectively bringing closure to the injustice that had occurred within those walls decades ago. The hospital, no longer a tomb of secrets, now stood as a quiet symbol of hope and ethical renewal. The question of whether the family was held accountable was answered by this act. The legacy of the child was used not for vengeance, but for profound, lasting restoration. I fulfilled the promise to my uncle, and the silence of St. Jude's was finally a true peaceful silence, a place of rest instead of a vault of sorrow. The weight of the past, so heavy and palpable in the decaying halls of St. Jude's, had finally been lifted, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, restorative power of truth. The immense, imposing structure that once whispered of tragedy and corruption now stood transformed, its purpose quietly and completely redefined. The shadows that clung to the third-floor south wing, the ones my uncle had lamented, receded in the warm light of the new foundation's work, replaced by the profound, comforting stillness of reconciliation. The discovery was complete, the narrative closed, and the human cost of the secrets now honored. The child, whose life began in secrecy and sorrow, had grown to embody the compassion of the nurse who fought for them, turning the hospital's grievous history into a gentle and powerful message of hope for the future. I stood outside the now quiet grounds, feeling the deep, settled satisfaction of a task fully completed. The knowledge that the hospital's story had found its happy ending not in fantasy, but in the enduring reality of human kindness. The profound sadness that had permeated the atmosphere was gone, replaced by a quiet, deep peace that extended far beyond the crumbling brickwork. All the threads, the lavender scent, the whispered name, the hidden records, and my own broken promise were now seamlessly woven into a final, comforting tapestry of closure. The end of the story, sweet dreams.